Welcome back. You're still tuning in to News and Views with myself, Salailo Makudi. It's time for our hashtag Africa Focus feature. And this time around, we'll be heading over to West Africa, Burkina Faso to be specific, where the Transitional Parliament has just approved a sweeping new bill, which essentially will see the banning of all political parties, repealing the legal framework that underpins a multi-party democracy within the country. The government says this quote-unquote reset will end polarization, but critics warn it's the latest move by Captain Ibrahim Traore's military-led government junta, if you will, to consolidate power and shrink civic space. The United Nations human rights officials have urged the authorities to reverse course and protect freedom of association. And to help us unpack what this means for democracy, for governance and conflict in the Sahel, I'll be speaking to Gwinyai Taruvinga, researcher at the Wits Global Change Institute. Gwinyai, thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure having you on Salam Media. Good morning.
Good morning, Selo. Thank you so much for having me as always.
No, the pleasure is all ours. And I think we'll jump right into it. Captain Ibrahim Traore, I think he's lorded Africa over. But there's some concerns of traces of, a typical African dictator. A lot of people are saying we've seen this story unfold before. We've seen this movie before. It's nothing new. What's your opinion on this? All political parties essentially banned. Democracy not looking like the way forward for Burkina Faso.
Yes, I think definitely. I think these are, some of the discussions that we've been having on the African continent, especially these issues concerning the idea of democracy and how democracy has sort of been regressing over the last few years. And we're seeing this, and I think Ibrahim Traore fits that particular description, because when he came into power, there was this idea that he was a reformed leader who was serving the interests of the youth. He was a young leader who was coming in, and he had promised to sort of shift Burkina Faso from this direction of an autocratic regime to a regime that was going to be basically based on the needs and the will of the people. However, this latest incident that we are seeing goes against that norm. It also now fits into this narrative of a military regime that often comes in promising this idea of a developed state, developed within the context of democracy. However, what we begin to see is that military regimes then tend to go back into their shell and become more autocratic. And this is something that we're seeing in Burkina Faso.
How do you respond to those that are saying, this is maybe a style of governance that Africa maybe requires? We tried democracy in many parts of the continent. It doesn't seem to work. If it's not coups, then it's rigged elections. And, we know the story around Africa. Maybe this could be the way. This could charter a new way of governance for the African continent. No one said democracy should be set in stone and should be the only way that governance is done, especially on the continent where it's a concept brought by colonial masters.
So I often argue to say that there are two things we need to take into consideration. The first thing being that Africa is a continent. Africa is not a country. Therefore, within Africa, we have different countries, and these countries are governed differently. Unfortunately, one of the biggest disadvantages that we have on the African continent is that we battle with these legacies of colonialism. So if we were to look at the history of African countries, we begin to see that colonialism shaped what we see currently today as a post-colonial state. This applies to South Africa, this applies to Zimbabwe, and this also applies to our current discussion on Burkina Faso, where the history of the French institutional setup is something that we're currently seeing. This idea of military coups in Burkina Faso goes back to the early 80s, it goes back to the 70s and the 60s as well. This is something that has been going on for a very long time. So when we now then make the link to democracy, we need to be clear as to, firstly, how are we defining democracy, right? Firstly. And secondly, these institutions that we have on the African continent mirror the colonial regimes. They mirror the systems of before. And as a result of that, this is why we then have the challenges that we are currently having. So it's a bit simplistic to just say democracy is not working. We need to apply the relevant historical context to each and every African country, and then make a decision based on that. But I would say that democracies are one of the few vehicles that we have on the African continent to hold our leaders accountable. It's one of the few vehicles that we have to also ensure that citizens have, a decent living. Citizens have, the right and to dignity and all these things that are enshrined in different countries' constitutions.
I want to touch a bit on, from your vantage point, what could be the motivation, and maybe what could be behind the framing of this move by Ibrahim Traore's government. They're defending it as necessary to end polarization and to rebuild the state. In your assessment, what could be the real rationale behind abolishing political parties entirely? Could it be maybe security, political control, or maybe seeking an alternative, as we just discussed?
Well, look, I think from any basic political vantage point, this is about power. In politics, we define the study as who gets what, when, and how. And clearly, what we are seeing when leaders begin to suppress opposition, when they begin to subvert the will of the people, it is clearly a power play. And this is what we're seeing in Burkina Faso. It's all about power, and we're seeing that it's about retention of power. Hence, initially, when he came in through a military coup, that was an initial power play. And again, when we look at Burkina Faso, like I said, history shows us that even, the so-called popular leaders such as Thomas Sankara also fell victims to military coups, because again, it was all about power. So to answer your question, I think it's a clear, blatant political power play that we're seeing in Burkina Faso.
One other argument that they make, and this is from the government themselves, they claim that the proliferation, if I may, of more than 100 political parties before the coup caused division and dysfunction. How persuasive do you think that argument is to you? And what problem is this measure really trying to solve?
So, so in 1987 in Burkina Faso, there was a military coup that removed Thomas Sankara, and basically Thomas Sankara's friend Blaise Compaoré then replaced him, and he ruled Burkina Faso up until 2014. He was removed. So Blaise Compaoré was removed due to protests. And one of the key grievances of the people who were protesting was this idea of saying that, the democratic space in Burkina Faso was shrinking. So one can argue to say that initially this is what the people of Burkina Faso wanted, which was a
True.
democratic state. And I think this is again something we need to take into consideration, to say historically as well in Burkina Faso, a lot of the coups that have happened, one of the things that the coup leaders have said is that we're trying to restore democracy, and we're trying to restore this idea of good governance within the country. So again, I think I'll go back to say that democracy is important within this context, and it's also at the heart of some of these challenges that we're seeing in Burkina Faso. However, because of these power plays that we are discussing, we are seeing that it's being manipulated to a certain extent by leaders.
And I want to touch on, I think, a point that you briefly touched on, because there are some reports that, some citizens, and at least this is coming from state media coverage, so I don't know, we can take it with a bit of a pinch of salt, but they're essentially saying some citizens have welcomed this ban as a way to end political chaos, as previously mentioned. How should we understand public sentiment in this case, and can popular support for strong leadership coexist with democratic freedoms?
So I think it goes back to the previous question you asked me, where I think you mentioned the point that democracy is sort of being seen in a negative light on the African continent. We sort of look at it as something that has been imposed on us by, former colonial regimes. And I think your question actually then speaks to the heart of the citizens and what they need. And what we are beginning to see again is that citizens are seeing that democracy is not necessarily delivering what it promised. So it could be jobs, it could be water, electricity, or whatever it is, but democracy is not acting in that particular manner. And this is why then you find certain people would be in favor of leaders such as Ibrahim Traore, who have promised to, to sort of use a different form of governance that we are used to. and then often also promising certain things. So citizens will then obviously, I don't want to say fall prey, but obviously then believe that, because for them, they'll say we've had democracy for X amount of years, but it hasn't necessarily translated into the lives that we want. Then we begin to see that our leaders then also often also play that particular tune as well, and citizens then also fall to prey to that as well. So to answer your question, I think it's more citizens becoming frustrated with this idea of democracy and its failure to deliver what citizens want.
Lastly, before I let you go, Gwinyai, what does the future look like for a country like Burkina Faso right now? Is there any credible pathway back to competitive politics in the country? Or is it going to be the same old story that we've seen unfold in the Sahel, where coups have become the order of the day?
So, unfortunately, I think what we see with countries that have a history of military coups is that military coups then become the norm. So, when we often say that one coup begets another coup, and it becomes a cycle. And this is unfortunately something that actually Burkina Faso also fits in within that particular context. But to answer your question, I would always say that power is one of the most important elements of politics, and power lies in the people. And if the people of Burkina Faso do not obviously address this, then it's highly unlikely that something will change. And again, power lies in the people, and it is up to the people to take, the lead in that, to sort of stand up to the regime to say this is what we want or this is what we don't want. And Burkina Faso actually has a strong history of citizens doing that. Like I mentioned earlier, Blaise Compaoré was removed in 2014 due to popular protests. We've seen this with the Gen Z protests we saw last year, to say that people are very powerful. And if they do decide to say that we do not want this form of governance, it will actually change the trajectory of a particular country. So to answer your question, power lies in the people, and it's up to the people to decide.
Well, there you have it. Gwinyai Taruvinga, always a pleasure having you on Salam Media. Really appreciate you giving us the time and for those wonderful insights.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
There you go. This has been hashtag Africa Focus feature with a keen focus on Burkina Faso. I know a lot of my listeners are big fans of Ibrahim Traore. But if you're in South Africa at this current moment, would you appreciate a leader, a government that says, okay, what's going to happen from now onwards? We're going to ban all political parties, and there's not going to be any elections from now onwards. Do you think that could be the way to go about things? Do you think democracy is still the right vehicle, especially for countries on the African continent, for governance? Can engage with us. Our studio line is 011-680-0355 on WhatsApp, 061-766-0355. This has been hashtag Africa Focus. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we focus on water and how cities, how towns, and how everyone, especially in Joburg, is affected by it. I know we're affected by it here at the office, so it's going to be an interesting conversation. More on that after this.